Hi there, podcast and public radio fans. Heath Drusen here, host and creator of the Extremely American podcast. I'm working on season 3, which is an urgent story about neo-Nazi terrorists and how they helped build a modern white supremacist movement, even from prison. Some of their ideas have even made it to today's White House. It's both a gripping true crime story and a timely warning about threats to our democracy. And this time, my investigative reporting is funded by you. To support the project, please make a tax-deductible contribution at extremelyamerican.org. That's extremelyamerican.org. And thanks.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. You're listening to Idaho Matters. More than 30 years ago, the murder of 18-year-old Angie Dodge shook Idaho Falls, and it captivated the nation. And I remember it vividly. I was a young television reporter in Idaho Falls back in 1996, and I actually covered the case as it was unfolding. And over the years, I actually continued following this story. It really stuck with me, even interviewing Chris Tapp here on Idaho Matters shortly after his release from prison in 2019. He had been jailed for 20 years, wrongfully convicted of killing Angie. Well, now a new podcast from ABC News in 2020 is revisiting that extraordinary and really heartbreaking journey. It's called The Snare, and it explores not only Angie's murder, but the wrongful conviction that followed, the persistence of Angie's mom, Carol, and the long search for the truth. Joining us today is Maggie Rulli. She is ABC News correspondent and the host of The Snare. Maggie, it's really nice to have you on the show today.
It's so great to be here and incredible to actually speak with you. I mean, you've been with this story since the beginning. You must have been amazing to follow that evolution. As you just alluded to a bit, there are so many twists and turns in this case, and sort of nothing plays out the way you think it's going to. And so to have watched that unfold in real time is really incredible.
Well, it's one of these things, Maggie, I think that what really stuck with me is that I am not that much older than Angie. This was like my first job out of college. I was, I think about 23. She was 18. I was living in an apartment on my own in Idaho Falls, about 2 miles or so away from where Angie lived. And what I remember about that time is that not only, was I this little baby reporter covering this story, but being a young woman, being single, living on my own, right? And there was a time where when after Angie was killed, that the police said, we don't have a suspect and people should be concerned. So I think that's part of why, it stayed with me for so long.
Yeah, it's a great point. And we really try to explain that a bit in the podcast, just how much this really rocked Idaho Falls. It's not a very big town, and everyone kind of knew what was happening. And to your point, you lived through this. People were scared. They weren't sure, is there some serial rapist murderer on the loose? Did Angie know the person who raped and killed her? We talked to a lot of the police department, and they never really covered something like this before. They never really investigated something like this before. And so these investigators were not only up against something they hadn't really had to deal with in the past, they were also under immense pressure from the town. People were scared. People were demanding that they find whoever did this.
I'm curious, Maggie, how did you learn about this story?
Yeah, I came at it much later than you, and it was after ABC 2020 and ABC Studios on Hulu did another special on the investigation tapes, and they had dove really deeply into this story in the past, and there was this idea of turning it into a podcast because we had all this amazing audio that had never been used before. This podcast has some of never before heard interrogation tape moments that Chris Tapp shared with police, and so we're able to really rely on that audio to help tell this story. And then, of course, interviews with Chris Tapp, after he was released. We have interviews with Carol Dodge. And so being able to just dive into that material in, a 6-part series podcast has been incredible and opened up the story in ways that we hadn't been able to before.
So I've listened to a little bit of the podcast. I'm in episode 3 now, but for folks who maybe they remember the headlines, maybe they don't, maybe they weren't even born when this happened.
Yeah.
How do you describe Angie's story, and why do you think it continues to resonate nearly 30 years later?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's kind of incredible. It's 30 years almost to the day that Angie was raped and murdered. And I think there's so many reasons that this story is still so powerful. You already sort of mentioned on one of them. I think a lot of people see themselves in Angie, right? We've all kind of been that young woman growing up in the world. You're living on your own for the first time, and you can feel that fear that she went through. The other reason for me personally that hit me so hard was Carol Dodge. I'm a
Hmm.
mom of young kids, and Carol speaks so raw about what she went through. And she's so honest about the pain that it caused in her life. But, she just did not quit. This, what happened to her daughter rightfully took over her life, but she's really the one that was the driving force behind finding Angie's true killer. And this spent,
Hmm.
years, decades of her life dedicated to this. So that commitment, that just relentless search by this mother to find justice for her daughter. I mean, oh, I have to tell you, there were so many times I would hear certain sound bites from Carol, the sound that we have from her. And I'd hear it a dozen times, and every time I'd have to hold myself back from crying during table reads. It is just that emotional. And then the third reason I think this also hits home is Chris Tapp. He was that man, as you
Hmm.
said, who wrongfully convicted of this crime, spending about 20 years in prison. And, we really dive into the process of why police thought he was guilty. And they had a confession, right? Chris Tapp, a friend of Angie's, they never found his DNA on the crime scene, but they had this confession from him. And I think it really dives into how there are two victims of this case. You obviously have Angie and her family, but then you have this man, Chris Tapp, who, because of that false confession, went to jail for 20 years. And
Yeah.
it dives into that whole story of the ripple effect of this crime and what it did not just to the community, but multiple people involved.
I want to talk a little bit more about Carol in a minute, but I do want to
Mhm.
talk about this wrongful conviction of Chris Tapp.
Yeah.
Um, because as you were, producing the podcast, going through all of that audio tape, did you find yourself approaching this as, a true crime story, or a criminal justice, story, or was it something else entirely?
It's so interesting. It was everything, right? And when I talk
Yeah.
to people about this, I say, if you love true crime, this story's for you. But even if you don't love true crime, this story's for you because it has family dynamics, and it has this criminal justice element and the questions of police tactics and false confessions. I mean, one thing that stands out so strongly to me, I think there's this belief. I mean, I have it before this podcast where it's, how could you ever confess to something you did not do? Right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's mind boggling.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you say you murdered someone or were a part of a murder if you had nothing to do with it? I mean, Chris Tapp had nothing to do with this rape and murder, that he confessed to being a part of it. And it's almost like you break down the anatomy of that confession and what happened. And we brought in experts to take a look at the interrogation tapes and the tactics used by police. And it's fascinating. One expert made this point that these tactics that were used much more commonly in the 90s, uh, they were really good at getting confessions out of guilty people, but they were also really good at getting confessions out of innocent people. And sadly, Chris Tapp's not the only innocent person that has given a false confession. So
Yeah.
it's still almost hard to wrap your mind around. Again, you can't imagine saying you did something you didn't do, but by the end of listening to these experts and listening to the interrogation tapes and listening to Chris Tapp himself, you start to have a better understanding of how potentially someone actually could do that, confess to something they didn't do.
Well, and it's the amount of hours, right, that he was
Yeah. Yeah.
interrogated. And I think sometimes that gets forgotten is that, and he was
Mhm.
20 years old. And, you say
Yeah.
you have young children. I mean, I have an 18-year-old. And,
Mm.
what a horrible nightmare. And I mean, not only for, as you said, what happened to Angie, but to Chris and his family, right? And then confessing to this. What was it like for you to listen to those tapes in their
Mm.
entirety?
It's hard. You hear moments where, to your point, remembering how he was still so young, he talks about being nervous and scared, and you can hear it in
Hmm.
his voice. Later on, when he becomes, an adult and he's been in prison and he was exonerated, he talks about how he just was trying to please everyone and sort of make them happy and genuinely help them with this case. So he thought that by coming back in, sitting for those hours of interrogation and polygraph tests, he thought that he was trying to help, but then that help slowly kind of turned into him questioning himself and his own reality. And you see that evolution. It's something like 60 hours of tape between the
Oh, yeah.
interrogations and the polygraphs that this 20-year-old went through. And you can start to hear how he questions himself. He almost doesn't know what's real anymore. And you start to understand how he confessed to this crime.
When people hear portions of those interrogations today, because you play them in the podcast, what do you think will stand out the most to folks listening?
I think it's this idea that uh, the things people say can be so influenced, and that maybe things like confessions aren't as concrete as you think they are. I think people hear the word confession and think that's it, guilty, full
Hmm.
stop. And this really makes you question uh, confessions and the things people go through when they're arrested. And again, you can understand why, going back to the beginning, these police were under so much pressure, and they really thought that they were getting to the bottom and solving this case. They were doing everything they could to question people. They brought so many people in. They did hard questioning on dozens of people. They did, about 100 DNA tests. They were really going at people. And, Chris Tapp just decided to try to really help and spend so much time with them. And it was because of, you know, i- the way that he approached these sessions that sort of led to this false confession. And I think it
Hmm.
will it will shock people and also sort of make them question a bit their own assumptions about
So,
confessions.
so let's talk about that a little bit, because this case has actually become one of our country's best known examples of a
Mm.
false confession. And I'm curious about, did reporting on this change how you think about interrogations and confessions? Because it certainly did for me, following this story,
Mm.
for 30 years.
Yeah, and a lot of the experts we spoke with did make the point that a lot of these techniques have evolved greatly in 30 years. And whether it's from this case
Hmm.
or other cases similar, people have really learned better techniques to get true confessions. And the police officers that took part in this case, it's important to note, they feel that they did everything right, that it was proper. They've never been charged with anything, and they never, committed any crimes. They were using the techniques that were commonly used at the time to, find the person they thought was guilty. But I think since then, techniques have changed. We've learned quite a bit about better ways to get confessions out of guilty people. And you actually see that, when eventually at the end of this case, when Chris Tapp is exonerated and they end up finding the man who's guilty of this crime, they're
Hmm.
very, careful to make sure they do this, where they say the right way. They're going to be very methodical with this. They're going to use confession techniques that are interrogation techniques that are common in today's police culture. So you almost see that evolution in the over the 20 years at the time that it took between Chris Tapp and the man who was ultimately found guilty. You do see how things have changed and the process
Hmm.
has changed as well.
So, Maggie, as I mentioned in the very beginning, I actually had the opportunity to interview Chris Tapp after he was released from prison. I interviewed him in July of 2019. And one of the things that stayed with me was just how young he was when investigators focused on him.
Mm.
But the other thing that stood out is that, Chris talked about Carol Dodge, Angie's mom, and how Carol was an advocate for him. And when I heard that, I remember being stunned. But he said that, I mean, he and Carol, they became friends. She believed him. She believed that he was not the killer. In fact, Carol was the person who called the Idaho Innocence Project to get them involved in this case. What When you had the opportunity to talk with Carol, what stood out to you? Because to this day, I am still stunned by the fact that she truly knew. She was like, he didn't do it. Like I know
Mm.
that, and she fought for his innocence.
Yeah, I mean, this has to be one of perhaps the most, unlikely duos in any true crime story I've ever heard, right? You have the
Hmm.
mom who lost her daughter, and then the man convicted of killing her daughter team up. It's sort of like nothing you would ever expect. But this all started because Carol, she was just on this relentless search. When Chris Tapp went to prison for this crime, she knew there was someone else out there because Chris Tapp's DNA never matched the crime scene. And they had this
Hmm.
critical piece of DNA that they knew, right? Whoever left this DNA here was involved in this rape and murder, and they could never match it. So Carol knew someone else involved in her daughter's death is still out there. So she was just determined to find them. There are these stories of her kind of going into dodgy neighborhoods and questioning people, of showing up at the police station every week, giving them her updates, asking for their updates. I mean, relentless is almost too weak of a word for what she was. She was just this force of nature. And over the course of that, she ended up deciding to sit down one day and watch all of the interrogation tapes, 60 hours of them, to
Wow.
see if there was anything that police missed or she missed that Chris had to say about the crime. And when she got to the end of watching them, she realized, oh my gosh, this man's innocent. So not
Mm.
only is my daughter's true killer walking out there free in the world, but the wrong man is sitting in jail for this crime. And then she's the one that called, Chris's attorney. Chris's attorney, told us, never in my wildest dreams did I expect to get a call from the victim's mother saying, how can I help? And as you pointed out, she, alerted the Innocence Project. I mean, she really became one of Chris's biggest advocates and fought for him. And there's this moment that sticks with me forever where he's finally released from jail and Carol is waiting for him outside and they hold
Mm.
hands and they're together in that moment. And again, it's these two people who became victims together because of this one crime. And both of them now fighting for justice, one for freedom, one to find justice for her daughter, but both of them wanting the truth about this crime to come out.
One of the things that stood out to me in the very first episode of the podcast, which I had never known, and Carol says it in her own words. I mean, we do know that Angie saw her mom the night that she was killed, went over to the
Mm,
house, um, and then she says to her mom, "I did something really stupid." And
mm,
as I'm listening, I'm like, "Okay, what was it?" And then Carol says, "I never asked her what that was and how that haunts
mm.
her." Can you talk about that a little
Yeah.
bit? Because I just, and especially as a mom, I mean, it broke my heart.
Yeah. And it's one of those emotional moments. And, it's so easy, I think, to sort of blame yourself in some of this. Why didn't you ask
Hmm.
more questions? Why didn't I follow up? Why didn't I just force her to stay with me that night? Right. And you can see why you're asking yourself these questions. And, Carol admits that that's haunted her for years. And, we still don't really know what Angie was talking
Yeah.
about. We don't know um, what she didn't tell her mother that night. And I think to this day, it probably still, is in the back of Carol's mind. Uh, but I have to say, this one moment, yes, I'm sure that still haunts Carol. But after 20 years of this hunt of hers, when they finally do catch the man whose DNA matched the crime scene, and then he also confessed to the rape and murder, um, there's this moment Carol speaks out from the courthouse and she says, something along the lines of, I can finally stop being crazy. I can finally go back to my
Oh.
life. I missed my grandchildren grow up because I was so dedicated to this case. I missed my grandchildren grow up, right? That
Mm.
line,
Yeah.
just because this, the loss of her daughter and the way she was so violently taken from her consumed her. And you understand why, right? And that this pursuit of her daughter's killer consumed her, so much that she called herself crazy. And there was definitely this relief that you felt from her, this tragic relief that maybe now she could finally start to live her life again in some capacity now that the true killer was behind bars.
I think it seems almost impossible to overstate Carol's role in helping
Mm.
uncover the truth. How central is her story to the podcast? I mean, and really to this entire investigation.
Yeah, I mean, she's the heart of it, right? Not only is she this
Yeah.
driving force that helps, keep the momentum behind the investigation going over all these years, but she's this reminder too that the victims are people. Sometimes that can get lost when you're covering a case, and you have this mother who always reminds you that Angie was her only daughter. Angie was this person that brought light and life to every room she entered, and you have her mother not letting anyone forget that. And you mentioned how important she is. She worked alongside a great team, right? They brought in more investigators. They brought in the Innocence Project. They brought in genealogy experts, but Carol kind of was the one that never let anyone forget, right? She made sure this case
Hmm.
never went cold. And there's something to be said for that person that's just making sure eyes are on the case and that you are bringing in the best experts that you can. And she was also the one uh, not only fought to get Chris Tapp out of jail, but then kept fighting to find the true killer, and brought some of this new genealogical testing to police officers.
Yeah.
She flagged that we've made so many advances in DNA testing. Let's use this. And she worked with some of the investigators that have been brought back onto the case to sort of re energize this investigation. And they use, at the time, this cutting edge genealogy technology to um, use DNA that was 20 years old. That they had saved, and they traced it using genealogy testing. They were able to kind of deconstruct a family tree and break down not only what they thought that the killer might look like, but also find his distant relatives. And that's
Hmm.
ultimately how they tracked him down.
Was there a moment during your reporting on this that something you uncovered something or someone said something that fundamentally changed like your understanding of the case? Because there, as you said in the beginning, there's so many twists and turns
Mm.
to this case that if you honestly, I think, don't dig into it, you might honestly think it was like a made for TV movie and being like, there's
It's
no
so
way,
true.
right? There's no
Yeah,
way this is true.
100%. I mean, it's one of those cases that you almost can't believe it really happened. And again, I think for me, those two people, Chris Tapp and Carol Dodge, I keep going back to them. It's for me the moment of Chris talking about his confession and how he thought he was just doing the right thing, how he thought he was helping the police. And then all of a sudden, he somehow confesses to this crime. And, even as now a man looking back on that when he was, just 20 years old, that moment of,
Hmm.
that one sort of mistake and what it did to his life. And, for Carol, oh, that one gut-wrenching moment when she talks about missing her grandchildren grow up. I think it's just a
Yeah.
reminder of what it took to get to where we are today. And it did really take someone like Carol and, her powerful love for her daughter to solve this case. And even though Carol sacrificed years and years of her life, that's kind of what it took to actually find the person that did this crime.
I firmly believe that if Carol Dodge had not been this central figure, had not been as persistent as she was,
Mm.
if she did not believe Chris Tapp, I don't know if the real killer would have ever been caught. Do you think that's a fair assessment after doing all of the reporting that you've done on this?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, of course, very talented investigators were involved, and the town did, re-energize the case and bring in new investigators. And
Hmm.
you had the Innocence Project, and you had this new genealogy testing. You did have, and, of course, Chris Tapp's attorney. So you did have an amazing team that was brought in. But I think it was just Carol's refusal to let this case go cold. I mean, unfortunately, think about how many cold cases are out there. Think about how many crimes don't get solved. And sometimes what it takes is that person just saying, "Don't forget," and refusing to quit.
Hmm. So I think a lot of folks here in Idaho, in particular here in the Treasure Valley where we are, will probably remember the arrest of Brian Dripps. This happened in May of 2019. He was arrested in Caldwell, um, and really I think this idea that a decades long mystery had finally been solved because before Brian was arrested, Chris Tapp had been released from prison
Mhm.
about 2 months before that. Here's what I find interesting, though. Your podcast suggests that the story doesn't necessarily end right there. So, can you talk about that? And why doesn't it end like with a nice, neat little bow and like, oh, we found the real killer. He's in prison. We can in a sense wipe our hands of this.
Yeah. First, finding, the DNA match was one thing, but police admit they had to really be tight about this one. They had to go about the right way. There's this amazing stakeout scene where they wait outside of Brian Tripps's house and track him and learn his routine and find his cigarette butt. And that's how they
Yeah,
confirm his DNA. And then they bring him into the station. They befriend him. They make him feel so comfortable that he ends up sort of getting this decades old crime off of his chest. So there's an elaborate process of actually making sure that everything to convict Drips was by the book, and to make sure this was an ironclad case. So as you said, he goes to jail. You have Chris Tapp, who now not only has been released for prison, but also exonerated of all of his crimes. And he is paid a multi-million dollars from the state for the
hmm
time he was spent in jail. He ends up becoming an advocate for those who are wrongfully convicted, helping pass an act in Idaho for the wrongfully convicted. So he has so much ahead of him. He's in his early 40s, but he lost those 20 years of his life.
yeah,
Those years you really grow up and get jobs and make a family. And so here he was, newly released, a new life ahead of him, and you want this to be sort of this amazing ending. And unfortunately, we learn that, about 4 years after being released from prison, he himself is killed in a fight.
yeah.
And that case is still ongoing. And we expect the trial in that case to happen next year. But, sadly, it's kind of not the ending that you want from this podcast, if I'm honest, right? You want this
Right.
amazing, uplifting ending where Carol and Chris go off happily into the future. And instead, it's more real than that. It's messy in real life. And very sadly, yeah, Chris Tapp loses his life after he's released from prison.
After spending so much time, I mean, immersed in this case,
Mhm.
I can only imagine. What do you hope that listeners take away from the podcast?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think for this podcast in particular, there's that mother's love and that knowledge that it never leaves you no matter what happens. And that knowledge that the fight matters, right? Carol's fight
hmm
mattered. She made a difference. She took her love and her grief and her pain and she channeled it into this fight that not only got a man released from prison, but it found the true killer and it led to new legislation being passed in the state. And I mean, that sort of applies to everything in life, right? If we don't quit, if we use that love to channel, real change in the world, it's kind of a way to find beauty out of this, horrific crime.
Before I let you go, what do you think this case tells us about the strengths, but also the weaknesses of our justice system here in the U.S.? Because as you and I chatted about, I mean, yes, tactics have changed; they've evolved over the
Mm.
last 30 years. But there are people still being wrongfully convicted today.
Yeah, of course. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, yes, there are strengths. I think, this story shows you how much the police cared. They really
hmm
cared about finding Angie's murderer. They showed up, they dedicated hours of their time. They never let it go cold either. They were always working on this. They reinvigorated the case, 20 years later. And so they cared. They really, really cared. But I think it also shows you that there are flaws in any system and nothing is perfect. And you know, it's important that they evolve and learn from the past. And you kind of see that evolution take place in the podcast as well.
I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk with us about this. As I said, it has been a case that has stayed with me for 30 years. And I appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate the fact that people who maybe haven't known about this case get the opportunity to learn about it. So thank you for your time, Maggie.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for listening and having me on. And it was a pleasure to talk to you, someone that has lived this as well. I mean, fascinating to hear all that you went through with this also.
Well, I appreciate that. We've been speaking with Maggie Rulli. She's an ABC News correspondent, also host of the podcast, The Snare. We've been discussing the case of Angie Dodge. Now, you can listen to the podcast anywhere you get podcasts. I recommend you do. And we will also put a link to our 2019 interview with Chris Tapp. We'll put that on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. And thanks so much for listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. Do you have thoughts about today's episode? Make sure you email us at idahomatters@boisestate.edu or reach out on our socials. And if you haven't yet, could I ask you to leave us a review wherever you listen? We read every single one, and we'd love to hear from you.
Love Boise State Public Radio podcasts? They are free to enjoy, but not free to produce. If you can give, your support helps keep shows like Idaho Matters and Scandalize available to everyone. Donate now at boisestatepublicradio.org.